Growing a big fat trunk for bonsai is not rocket science. The challenge, however, is how do you create a nice trunk that smoothly tapers without massive, obvious scars on it. That is what this video is about. Today, in this video, I will look at this Arakawa maple. Taper is had by allowing a trunk to grow and then to cut back. And once you cut back, you get a young sprout that's of course a lot thinner, and you allow that to grow out. Now you cut it back in time so that the new branch or the new leader is not as thick as the lower trunk, and that creates taper in your trunk. Now it is a myth to think that the lower trunk doesn't fatten as long as the upper branch is growing. This was completely rebuilt 1.5 years ago. In February of last winter, 1.5 years ago, I styled this tree out completely, and I looked at a couple of bigger wounds. I made some big cuts, and let's explore how these have recovered. Next to this, I'm going to have to remove all this wire. I'm going to look at these branches, and they are key to developing a smooth, scarless trunk. I'm going to air layer these off, and I'll explain later on why I'm going to air layer them off instead of just clipping them off. And by the time that is all done, we're at the end of the year, maybe early spring, in a year from now. Let's go back 1.5 years and I'll show you what I did at that time. And now if you look here, you can see this has completely healed over by now. So this has been 1.5 years and it has fully closed, and you can also see there's hardly any swelling left, and this scar is starting to crack and the bark is starting to show fissures. So in another year or two this will be pretty much invisible from the front. Also, where this branch and that branch were pretty much the same strength, this is now much clearer, the continuation of the trunk, and this really is becoming a side branch just sitting at an angle of the main trunk in an outer curve, exactly as I'd want to. Now it is a little bit hidden, but this is the whole area that I hollowed out, and there's still no bark. I can see here in the elbow a little bit of callus popping up, so it will grow over, but this is one of the problems of taking off a branch and leaving a side branch. The subflow is not very strong, and therefore you don't get this wound to close as quickly as, for instance, this one. Here the wound was really on the directional down and not between the side branch and the trunk. It's really on the side of the trunk. Here it is in the elbow between two branches and the main trunk, and therefore this doesn't heal over as quickly. Now if you compare this trunk to the image of just 1.5 years ago, you see that this trunk has gone from an abruptly cut off trunk into something that starts to taper into this trunk, and that is the result of multiple sacrifices that I'm growing out in the top area. And that is the way that you get nice taper. Every centimeter, every inch of thickness that the sacrifice adds is also added to the lower trunk, but because it is distributed over a much bigger trunk, you don't notice that it increases, because the diameter increase is not as fast as the diameter increase here. But the amount of wood added here is also added around this trunk. It's just over a much bigger area and therefore less obvious. Anyway, now if you cut off a trunk, what do you then get? Exactly, you get a chop. You see there's an old chop here and it has healed over completely. There's a chop here, it hasn't healed over yet. And there's a chop here, it has healed over. So you get one section of trunk, the second section of trunk, the third section of trunk, and I could decide to go with this as a trunk line, but I've decided to keep this as a side branch. This is my new trunk line, and where does it start? Well, it actually stops here at this little side branch, so here is where I'm going to cut it off. What you now also see is that the cut here is a lot bigger than this cut.
which is again is a lot bigger than that cut. And that answers one of the questions that one of my viewers had, is if you continuously allow these sacrifices to run out, every single time you get a big wound here. Exactly, but I let this run less long than the previous and less long than that previous. That's also why it is very important that when you do the development of a trunk, you first start off with the base, you look at the roots, how are the roots? Then you allow this lower base to grow, and at a certain point you cut it. If you decide to go with a few bigger cuts, then you make sure that the base is almost as big as you want it. Then the next one you let grow until it is about 2/3 of this lower base. Then the next one, again you let it grow until it's about 2/3 of the base. And that way the wounds consecutively get smaller. Now you can do this in 3 or 4 steps, like that's happened here. But some people decide, no, I'm just going to let these sacrifices run for 1 or 2 years, and then I'm going to cut them back to the first branch that has created, or the first node. And then I let it grow again. And what you then get is much smaller cuts. You don't see them all that much, but it takes a lot longer. So I am also a fan of allowing the trunk to first establish, getting a very big fat trunk and then making a very low cut and letting that grow out. But at that time you also need to make sure you cut the trunk in a way that it is healing over. Best method, of course, of reducing your trunk is not to have to cut on the front, but to have to cut at the back. And that's why I'm thinking about this branch as being my leader. It's not completely at the back, it is on the side, but here the cut will be at the slant, so you don't see it as much. Or I take this one and then the cut will be completely in the back and you don't see it at all once this has fattened up enough so that the transition becomes smooth. Now this has grown considerably and I don't want to create any more big wounds, so I'm going to have to cut this back significantly to enhance taper movement in this region. And at some point here in the back I'll probably have to remove this little branch here. It really is disturbing the view from here to the back, but there's still a sacrifice going down that I've crafted on here on the root. Now Arakawa has the name to be a poor rooter, and I think that it's particularly when this bark has come up. But here at the split it is still quite normal green bark, so I think it would root very nicely. And my intent is to remove the bark all the way up to here, so that I really get the basis of a twin trunk. But because it is quite sensitive or quite hard to get to root, I'm going to do this with sphagnum moss, which seems to be the best rooting media for the quickest success. And I'm going to use rooting hormone on this side. This is a bit awkward. My hands are in the way. I'm just going to do this now off camera because this is going to take another 5 to 10 minutes to clean out completely. But the concept of removing bark I think I don't need to explain. Now, to ensure that all the cambium cells in this exposed area are killed off, you can leave it open for half an hour, 20 minutes, or you can just use some rubbing alcohol. So you just take a little bit on the cloth and you just wash this area with it. Keep in mind this also will kill all the cells at the cut site itself. So once you've done this and let it dry out a little bit, then you make a very quick new top cut just along this edge, and that's where the rooting hormone will go, and the rooting hormone will also go on the bark. But this should now have effectively killed off most of the cells that are still alive, and therefore no bridging should occur. Famous last words, because I now am pretty sure that in one of the next scenes you'll see that there's bridging occurring. This is the liquid rooting hormone. I always take some out of the container so it doesn't get polluted, and this I just add right at the top of the cut. And keep in mind the roots will be coming from the bark and the living cambium just above the cut, and not the area that I've removed the bark off. So that is also the area that needs to be kept wet, but that's also the area that you need to add some rooting hormone to. It is not necessary to use this sort of rooting hormone, but it will speed up the process. And on more difficult to layer species like older Arakawas, this might be quite useful to get a better response. Now with this all done, I can just wrap it up. I think I'm just going to use a little pot with some sphagnum, or maybe a little baggie with some sphagnum. And then it's a matter of waiting weeks, maybe 1 or 2 months.
I always pre-drill these little holes because it is a bit of a clumsy thing to do. And then I attach it to a trunk above. Now the sphagnum is just moist. I've squeezed most of the water out of it. And I'm going to put it in here, and it's going to have to be connected to the trunk, but fairly loose. You don't want a very dense, heavy, wet, sogging ball in there. There needs to be oxygen exchange, needs to be loose. Yeah, so don't try to squeeze this as hard as you can. It really is not the intent to have a very dense root ball of moss in here. A big storm passed through, and this happened overnight. I am looking here at the moss, and there is some root formation, but it is connected to each other. So that leaves me no alternative but to gently remove the pot and then cut it off. At a challenge, I'm actually not allowed to stand on my left leg, so I'm just here with crutches, balancing out everything. So I'm not going to be able to show you everything that I do in detail. But let's see how this goes. The reason why I want to remove the pot, it is not sure how it has rooted, and I don't know where I can cut, because there might be small branches just below the air layer that I want to keep. This is not optimal. Let's see. So that was not a root. Good thing I didn't just separate. There is some little nodules there. Let's take this off. Might be able to get it to root as a cutting, but I don't think so. And then, yeah, guess I'll cover up the rest again and see whether this will still root. Let's see how long this survives and whether it roots. Let's take this one in, pot it up, and I don't think it will root. I think this will just die. August. If you look at this, this all looks like bark. So I need to clean this cut up and hope that it roots, because there are some indications of new roots. Well, the good thing, it hasn't died, but there's also still not real roots. But you see here these white dots, that is an indication that roots might be forming. I checked here, this is not actually growing over the actual cut side, but this is where it broke off. But I don't think it has bridged here. Can't find any bark between this part and the top part, so I'm just going to wrap it up. You can see here I scratched, but it seems to be just wood and not callus. Now the whole month of July has been raining, wet and cold. Basically we've been seeing temperatures barely reaching 20 Celsius, and 20 Celsius, that is about 60 Fahrenheit I think. And it has been raining almost every single day, so this is actually not really great when you have a pot like this. It stays cold and wet, and that doesn't help with new root formation. So I'm just going to give it a little bit more time. I do see some discoloration of the top, so I'm a little bit concerned that the tree is deciding the top is not worth keeping, which is also why you get this sprout. But often that is also when the air layer side starts to root. So let's give this another 2 or 3 weeks. It should be a little bit warmer this week. Maybe we'll be lucky then. We're in the middle of August, and what I now start to see here is that this entrance side is noticeably thinner than here the exit side. And here I also believe that there's some merging and fusing happening of these two tissues. There's a bit of thickening here on the root, which indicates that there is now sap flow between this branch and the bark. And I am going to wean this off the donor side, and I'm doing this by just removing part of the bark here. Now this doesn't seem like a lot, but this will reduce of course the sap flow from this branch into the main branch, and over time that will strengthen this connection. Now I'm not going to remove all, I'm just removing 2/3,
and then I'll see how this responds. So last week we had a heat wave, and that has resulted in this layer really crisping up. The color is really pale. If you compare that here to the original plant, it looks really well. It's actually sprouting. So I am concerned that there's something wrong now at the layering site. Maybe there is root formation, and this is the first indication that the sap flow has diminished from the main tree, or it is just dying. But I'm going to open it up and let's have a look and see whether there's any roots now. I haven't peeked yet, so for me also a surprise. This is always exciting, but it's also always a risk. If there's any roots, I don't want to damage them by moving this around. So in this case I'm just going to cut the wire, because I really have no idea what it looks like on the inside. It would be a shame if there's just 1 or 2 roots. This should be now completely loose, except for this one. Yeah. Look at that. This is really nice. I've got quite a few roots here at the base, and I do actually have a place to put this out of the wind and out of the sun. So I'm just going to take it off and plant it up and hope that the roots then take over. So these are very few roots. I'm going to plant it in a pot. I'm not going to remove any leaves, but I am going to put this in a shaded wintry position now. And just in case you're wondering how can you ever get something like this stable in a pot, well, you can't. But what I've done here at the cut end, just below the roots, I've put heavy aluminium wire. And here at the fork I've gently put aluminium wire around it as well. The pot is halfway pre-filled with substrate that's already wet, exactly to the point that this will sink in. And now it basically just rests a little bit here on these wires, which will reduce the movement, and the one in the pot will reduce the torque. And then I just fill it up with substrate, which I then need to of course soak in water as well. But then it is fairly stable. It can't just topple over all that easily. There's not so much pressure on the roots on the inside, and there's not so much torque. And of course I have a separation to finalize this wound with a sharp concave cutter and or knife. Edit the wound so that there's a nice smooth tapering wound, ideally a little bit depressed from the main trunk. If you have very sharp pliers like these, then you don't need to work with a knife. Otherwise you might need a knife to really clean out the edges. Just like that. And then of course a little bit of cut paste. This is cut paste made by Notion Bonsai. Seems to work well. But there's of course all sorts of Japanese brands as well. Especially if you're not in the EU, then Notion Bonsai might not be the easiest to use. Actually, I don't know. If you know, pop me a comment. Does Notion Bonsai also deliver outside of the EU? Right, then I have this graft here, which seems to have taken, but I'm going to leave that for a little bit longer. Just by continuing doing what I was doing already, right? Just removing ever more of the bark here on the donor side. Going to just let that sit and maybe in late fall or early spring separate completely. Now let me try to show you what I have now realized. Effectively, if you now look at these branches, what you see is this is an earlier cut. It has completely healed over, and then I allowed a side branch to develop. I wired this up, and then here I made this cut today. Another side branch develops in the opposite direction of where this was. So this comes forward a little bit, now it goes sideways again, and I can let this now grow out, and then for instance cut back here and get a bud here. There's another option for a bud there, or I can wire this out so it comes more vertical and just use this branch to build the upper canopy. I've not decided yet. I think that is it. This is how I build direction, movement and taper. Yeah, I hope you're subscribed. If not, do that now. If you have subscribed, why don't you just watch my next video? This was Jelle, growing bonsai, building taper and direction on an Arakawa Japanese maple. See you next time, and until then, keep growing bonsai.